Right now, Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Campbell announcing an update on the investigation into the death of State Police Trooper Enrique Delgado-Garcia. Let's listen in.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. On September 13th, 2024, Massachusetts State Trooper Enrique Delgado-Garcia died while training to become a Massachusetts State Trooper. He sought to become a state trooper to fulfill his dream of serving and protecting the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Shortly after Enrique's death and after consultation with Worcester District Attorney Joe Early, I appointed an independent investigator, Attorney David Meier, to review the facts surrounding Enrique's death. I want to thank Enrique's family, his friends, his fellow trainees, and the public for their tremendous patience as this process unfolded. I know that to some, this process has felt long and opaque. Independent investigations are careful and thorough by necessity. In order to maintain the integrity of their process, certain aspects cannot be shared with the public. That confidentiality is by design to ensure fairness for everyone involved. Enrique was a public servant. He began his career in the Worcester District Attorney's Office as a victim witness advocate. His family has spoken openly about his intention of being someone who made a difference in the community and his dreams of becoming a Massachusetts State Trooper. He was a son, a brother, an uncle, and a friend. And Enrique should be alive today. Given the extraordinary nature of these events and the complexity of this case, it was necessary to appoint an independent outside investigator. Death investigations are typically handled by the local district attorney. In this case, however, Worcester DA Joe Early appropriately determined that his office had a conflict because Enrique worked in his office as a victim witness advocate. Following conversations with DA Early, we determined that Enrique and his family deserved an investigation that was completely impartial and devoid of any perception or appearance of conflict. That's why I appointed Attorney Meier. Attorney Meier has extensive experience both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, including 12 years in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, where he supervised, investigated, and prosecuted death investigations within Suffolk County. He has since served as partner at Todd & Weld. In this case, David investigated the facts of Enrique's death and the circumstances that surrounded it, just as my office or any other district attorney's office and its investigators would have done. My office was briefed about the investigation along the way and provided logistical support. Because of the design of the investigation, Attorney Meier had his own independent team to conduct the investigation, and he had full autonomy in making investigatory and charging decisions in this case, which he will discuss shortly. I am grateful to Attorney Meier for his thorough efforts to follow the facts and to seek accountability to those responsible for Enrique's death. In no way is this investigation, in the charges it has yielded, a condemnation of all law enforcement. The men and women who choose to serve, protect our communities, often in difficult and dangerous circumstances. Our law enforcement members, including those who serve in my very office, are essential to public safety and the rule of law. I know just how much the Commonwealth benefits from the men and women in uniform who serve the public because I see it up close every day. Many officers go beyond their law enforcement jobs, mentoring young people, supporting community programs, actively working in our communities in a very challenging time to build trust. Their service deserves respect and recognition. And just as they protect us, it is our responsibility to ensure that our inspiring officers at the Massachusetts Police Training Academy are protected from preventable harms and to seek accountability when serious incidents occur. There is nothing more serious than the loss of a life. We can both honor the men and women who serve while also still ensuring accountability within a system, especially when someone dies. Lastly, while Attorney Meier's investigation focused on Enrique's death, there must be serious discussion and action with respect to reforms. I know that the State Police Colonel, Jeffrey Noble, has already undertaken efforts to effectuate change, and I'm grateful to him, and I look forward to supporting him in those endeavors going forward. Because this is an ongoing legal matter, there may be some questions that I cannot answer in order to preserve the integrity of Attorney Meier's case. We appreciate your continued patience, and at this time, I'd like to turn over the podium to Attorney David Meier.
Thank you, Attorney General Campbell, and good afternoon. On the day that I was appointed as independent counsel, I made a commitment to the family of Enrique Delgado-Garcia, to the Massachusetts State Police, to the public, and to the criminal justice system, that I would conduct the investigation professionally, thoroughly, and independently. I pledged to follow the facts and the law, to perform my work conscientiously and responsibly, and to exercise my independent judgment to reach whatever results the facts and the law dictated. I committed not to permit the speed of the investigation, the length of the investigation, or any other outside factors to influence the investigative process. I owed that to the family of Enrique Delgado-Garcia, to the Massachusetts State Police, to the public, and to the criminal justice system. When Attorney General Campbell appointed me, I knew nothing about the facts surrounding Enrique Delgado-Garcia's death or about the State Police Training Academy. I had no preconceived notion of the potential outcome of the investigation. With the support of an independent investigative team, my assignment was to gather the facts through any and all available investigative means, taking as much time as we needed to do things the right way, and to follow those facts and the applicable law wherever they may lead. I fully recognize that the investigative process has been lengthy and it has been conducted in silence, without public comment, at least on my part. That silence has been purposeful. It is a direct reflection of the nature of the investigation and of my ethical and legal obligations. At the same time, I can assure the public that the investigative process has been searching, it has been exhaustive, and it has been without outside influence. Given some of the challenges posed by the investigation, early last year, I sought judicial approval from the Chief Justice of the Superior Court to impanel a special statewide grand jury in order to conduct an independent fact-finding investigation into the circumstances surrounding the death of Enrique Delgado-Garcia. The impanelment of a special statewide grand jury enabled us to compel the testimony of witnesses, to memorialize testimony under oath, to subpoena relevant documents and information, and to gather the facts in a formal proceeding before an independent body. At each stage of the process, the investigative team and I met with the family of Enrique Delgado-Garcia to update them on the status of the investigation. We met with the family this past weekend, and we spoke to them this morning. Over the course of the past 9 months, the grand jury has heard sworn testimony from over 150 witnesses, the vast majority of whom have been state police officers. And the grand jury has reviewed close to 350 physical exhibits, the vast majority of which relate to policies, procedures, activities, and events at the State Police Training Academy. The evidence gathered by the special statewide grand jury has revealed that in the days and weeks prior to September 12, 2024, members of the State Police Training Academy committed a series of wanton and reckless acts in connection with various defensive tactics and physical confrontation training exercises conducted at the academy. The facts and circumstances underlying the wanton and reckless conduct include both A, affirmative acts by academy staff, and B, the failure of academy staff to take certain actions or omissions that they had a legal duty to perform during their daily interactions with the trainees, who were under their care, guidance, and supervision. The wanton and reckless conduct resulted in Enrique Delgado-Garcia suffering concussion-like symptoms as the result of unauthorized, unapproved, and unsupervised boxing-related sparring exercises that occurred during academy training activities on Wednesday, September 11, 2024. The wanton and reckless conduct culminated in Enrique Delgado-Garcia suffering multiple blunt force injuries to the head and massive brain bleeding as the result of the failure of academy staff to intervene and bring a stop to a competitive boxing match between Mr. Delgado-Garcia and a fellow trainee that occurred during academy training activities the following morning on Thursday, September 12, 2024. Mr. Delgado-Garcia died the following day, September 13, 2024, as a result of the head injuries sustained during the recruit-on-recruit boxing match that Thursday morning. Based upon the facts and the law, the evidence gathered by the grand jury compels criminal prosecution of certain members of the Academy's Defensive Tactics Unit, the supervisor of the unit, and 3 full-time instructors. These individuals engaged in ongoing interactions with Enrique Delgado-Garcia on September 11, when he suffered concussion-like symptoms, and on September 12, when he was knocked unconscious. These individuals also had direct management and direct control over the physical training exercises themselves. Factually and legally, each of these individuals owed a duty of care to Enrique Delgado-Garcia and to his fellow trainees. Each of them interacted with Mr. Delgado-Garcia and his fellow trainees on a daily basis, and each of them committed a series of wanton and reckless acts and omissions that resulted in Enrique Delgado-Garcia's death. Given their roles and responsibilities on the Defensive Tactics Unit and their control over the training exercises, the wanton and reckless conduct committed by these individuals violated 2 criminal statutes in particular. General Laws, Chapter 265, Section 40, alleging the crime of causing serious bodily injury to a person participating in a training program involving physical exercise, and General Laws, Chapter 265, Section 13, alleging the crime of involuntary manslaughter. In addition, the evidence demonstrated that when the supervisor of the Defensive Tactics Unit was asked specifically under oath before the grand jury when it was that she first learned about Enrique Delgado-Garcia's concussion-like symptoms, she repeatedly responded falsely. Given the circumstances of this investigation and the nature of the information at issue, her testimony before the grand jury violated General Laws, Chapter 268, Section 1, alleging the crime of perjury. Now, each of these charges are merely accusations. Each of these individuals is presumed to be innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. These individuals have not been and will not be arrested. I have requested that the court issue a summons for their appearance at an arraignment hearing to be scheduled in the near future in coordination with the court and with their individual attorneys. With respect to each of these charges and each of these individuals, I have intentionally not referred to any of the specific underlying facts that were gathered and considered by the grand jury. Given my ethical and legal obligations, this is neither the appropriate time nor place to do so. Given the paramilitary structure of the State Police Training Academy, various members of the Academy command staff had the authority and the ability to address many of the circumstances surrounding Enrique Delgado-Garcia's death. At the same time, the evidence before the grand jury demonstrated that the nature and extent of their personal knowledge, personal involvement, and personal participation in the specific acts and omissions that resulted in Enrique Delgado-Garcia's death were insufficient to support criminal charges. Based upon the evidence, a reasoned and responsible evaluation of the facts and the law does not support criminal prosecution of members of the Academy's command staff, nor does my professional respect for and commitment to the rule of law. Insofar as I have shared with you generally that certain wanton and reckless acts and omissions compel the criminal prosecution of certain members of the Academy's Defensive Tactics Unit, I want to ensure that certain additional facts are made abundantly clear. Based upon the testimony and the exhibits before the grand jury, there is no evidence that Enrique Delgado-Garcia was targeted in any way. There is no evidence that anyone, Academy staff, fellow trainees, or any others, harbored any personal animosity towards Enrique Delgado-Garcia. There is no evidence that anyone acted with deliberation, premeditation, or malice. One final comment. I take no personal satisfaction, none, from where these facts have led. But I am confident that the investigative team and I have carried out our assignment professionally, responsibly, and independently. And I am confident that we have done so the right way and for the right reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Meier. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Attorney General, a comment on the trainee who was involved in this boxing exercise. Any consequences for that trainee in this investigation?
Not in this investigation.
And when it comes
And I will
to-
just share what's being shared right now from the team is more detail on the charges and those who the charges are being brought against.
And Attorney General, when it comes to this investigation with the cost reaching $700,000, can you speak to the taxpayers on that investment and the results that were shared today?
So my job in this case, given the conflict that existed for DA Early, was to ensure that the family got an independent investigation that would be thorough, that would be handled well, with integrity, a standard of excellence, and devoid of any conflict or appearance of conflict. By reputation and integrity, David was one of the folks I considered and ultimately hired him knowing he would do a thorough job. A thorough job in following the facts, the law, and of course, reporting to the public where appropriate where his investigation has led, which he's done today. He gets nothing out of this. He charged below market rate to ensure that a thorough investigation was done, and that's exactly what happened here, and that's what the family deserved.
Do you expect there to be any kind of report issued about non-criminal findings? Like Attorney Meier mentioned, that there might not be cause to prosecute other folks, but just do we get more information about what all was going on?
So it's an ongoing investigation, and as it unfolds, Attorney Meier, and where appropriate, either together or separately, will continue to update the public on what can be shared. It's obviously an ongoing investigation, so we have to be extremely careful. That being said, Attorney Meier was tasked with an independent investigation to look into the facts and the circumstances surrounding Enrique's death, and that is what he has focused on. In addition to that, I also think it's equally important that the administration, EOPS, MSP, which I know Colonel Noble is already doing, look at reforms to bring about. I know that is underway, and I fully support the Colonel in those endeavors as they go forward. And of course, as more becomes public and able to share, I will do that.
What is the current status of these troopers? Are they currently on the force or are they on?
That's a question for MSP.
Are you able to share where they will be summoned and who will be taking over the case or who will be leading the case?
The indictments were just unsealed this morning, and as I indicated, we just had an opportunity to meet with the family over the weekend and again this morning, and the court process will then undertake, and as I said, I've been in contact with counsel for each of these 4 individuals, and we will coordinate with the court to schedule an arraignment hearing in the near future.
David, can you expand a little bit on the perjury charge? I know you can't go into too many underlying facts, but how serious is that in your mind, a sergeant committing a perjury on this?
Well, I'm not going to offer any of my personal opinions, respectfully. I think I outlined within my ethical and legal parameters and obligations what the allegations are, and everything else will play out in court.
AG
Last
Campbell, how about
question.
you? Do you want to comment on a state police sergeant committing perjury allegedly in this case?
I would just echo what Attorney Myers echoed to ensure that this case continues to unfold, respecting the rights of all involved, and of course due process. More will be shared as it unfolds in the courts, and he will share more when that's appropriate.
Do you have
That's the
any
last
specific
question, guys.
suggestions?
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Right now, a press conference just wrapping up, led by Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Campbell, announcing an update on the investigation of the death of Enrique Delgado-Garcia. Now, as you may remember, Delgado-Garcia died in September of 2024 while trying to become a state trooper. This afternoon, we learned that Attorney General Campbell hired attorney David Meier, independent counsel, to conduct an independent investigation, she says, because of the nature of this case. Attorney David Meier determined, after what he says was a 9-month-long investigation and examining 350 physical exhibits, so this includes policies, procedures, and events, there are 4 individuals, 1 supervisor, 3 instructors that are now facing charges, and he says participated in reckless acts and omissions at the academy in the days prior to Delgado's death. However, he did also say, Attorney Meier, that there's no evidence that Delgado-Garcia was targeted or that anyone acted with premeditation or malice. An arraignment date is still to be determined at this hour. But stay with WBZ and CBS News Boston. We will continue to follow this story and bring you the latest as it develops.